The grand courtroom loomed over its occupants, an imposing structure of dark wood and solemn faces. The air was thick with the murmurs of spectators and the occasional shuffle of legal papers. High above the room, the seal of justice gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a silent reminder of the weight of the law. At the center of it all sat Judge Gerald Reynolds, a man infamous for his no-nonsense approach. His sharp eyes scanned the room from beneath bushy gray brows, his mouth pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Judge Reynolds had earned a reputation for his impatience, his wit as cutting as his rulings. He had no time for foolishness, and above all, he had no tolerance for what he deemed arrogance. A bailiff cleared his throat, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. Next case, the State versus Jake Lawson. The audience shifted, intrigued. Some leaned forward, eager for what was to come. This case had already drawn whispers throughout the courthouse halls. A boy, just 17 years old, rose from his seat at the defendant's table. Jake Lawson was no ordinary defendant. He wasn't clad in an expensive suit like a seasoned attorney, nor did he have a defense lawyer whispering strategy into his ear. Instead, he stood alone. Jake was tall but lean, his posture more suited to a student than a courtroom brawler. His modest attire, a button-up shirt that had seen better days and a pair of well-worn jeans, made him seem even younger. But there was something in the way he carried himself, something that hinted at quiet confidence, a certainty that didn't belong to a teenager standing trial. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. "Where's his lawyer?" someone whispered. "Why is he alone up there?" another asked, incredulous. Jake cleared his throat and turned to face Judge Reynolds, his hands resting on the defendant's table. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor," he announced, his voice calm and unwavering. The courtroom erupted into hushed gasps. Judge Reynolds arched a skeptical eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. A slow smirk curled the corner of his mouth. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, shaking his head. Even the prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Daniel Harper, let out a chuckle. Harper, in his crisp navy suit, had been preparing for an open-and-shut case. He certainly hadn't expected to be up against a high schooler. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, calling for order. "Son, do you even understand what's at stake here?" he asked, his voice filled with thinly veiled amusement. "You are facing criminal charges. This isn't some high school debate competition." Jake met the judge's gaze without flinching. "I understand, Your Honor." The judge exhaled, rubbing his temple as though he were already exhausted by this spectacle. "And you're telling me, with a straight face, that you, a teenager with no legal experience, think you can outmaneuver a trained prosecutor?" Jake didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." A few snickers rose from the audience. Judge Reynolds shook his head. "Well, this should be interesting." The prosecutor, Daniel Harper, stepped forward with an air of confidence, papers in hand, already prepared to demolish the case. The defendant, Jake Lawson, stands accused of grand larceny, having allegedly stolen expensive electronics from a local store. "The evidence is overwhelming, Your Honor." He turned to face the judge, nodding as if this was already a done deal. The security footage places him at the scene. Witnesses have identified him. The store owner is prepared to testify. And yet, rather than securing legal representation, he chooses to defend himself. Harper let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "I admire the bravery, but let's be honest, this is delusional." The judge folded his hands. "Mr. Lawson, you do understand that if you're convicted, this could follow you for the rest of your life?" Jake nodded. "I do, Your Honor." The judge sighed. "And yet, no lawyer?" Jake took a breath. This was his moment. "No lawyer would take my case pro bono," he said simply. "I couldn't afford one, and I refused to take a plea deal for something I didn't do." The audience whispered again, intrigued. Judge Reynolds studied him carefully. His amusement faded just a fraction. "You insist on your innocence?" "Yes, sir," Jake replied, his voice steady. The judge leaned back. "Then let's see what you've got." As the trial officially began, curiosity in the room only grew. Who was this boy? Why was he so sure of himself? Jake wasn't a typical troublemaker. He had grown up in a struggling household, raised by his single mother, who had done everything she could to provide for him. Life had never been easy. He had been an average student on paper, barely making waves in school. Teachers had dismissed him as unremarkable, but that was because Jake never showed his true potential. He had spent hours in the library, devouring books on law, logic, and strategy, things that fascinated him but never showed up on his report card. He had worked part-time jobs to help support his mother, keeping a low profile in a world that never expected much of him. But now he stood before an entire courtroom, facing a seasoned prosecutor and a skeptical judge, with everything on the line. And yet, there wasn't a trace of fear in his eyes. Judge Reynolds lifted his gavel. "Very well. Mr. Harper, you may present your case." The prosecutor smirked, adjusting his tie. "With pleasure, Your Honor." Jake remained calm, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of the legal pad in front of him. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. They all thought they knew how this would go. Jake was just a kid. And yet, there was something about the way he stood, the way he looked at the evidence, the way he listened so intently. Was he truly as doomed as they all thought? Or was there something more to this teenager than anyone realized? The courtroom settled into silence as Prosecutor Daniel Harper rose from his seat. With the confidence of a man who had won more cases than he had lost, he straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and took his position before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harper began, his voice rich and smooth, "this is a simple case." He paced slightly, gesturing with controlled authority. The defendant, Jake Lawson, was caught on security footage at the scene of the crime. The stolen electronics, worth thousands of dollars, were found in his possession. Witnesses identified him. The evidence is overwhelming. He turned, locking eyes with the jury. "This case is not about doubt. It is about facts. And the fact is, Jake Lawson is guilty." A murmur of agreement rippled through the spectators. Harper's smirk widened. Then, slowly, Jake stood up. People shifted in their seats, eager to see how a 17-year-old with no legal experience would handle himself. Jake stepped forward, calm, composed, and met the eyes of every juror. "I'd like to begin with a question," he said. "What if the facts you've just heard aren't facts at all?" A pause. People blinked. Harper's smirk faltered, just a little. Jake continued, his voice measured. "We all trust evidence. We trust the justice system to be fair. But what if the system is wrong? What if the security footage doesn't tell the whole story? What if the so-called witnesses were mistaken?" His tone was not desperate, not pleading. It was rational, methodical, confident, and it was working. "For the next few hours, I'm going to ask you to do one thing. Think critically. Look at the details, not just the assumptions. Because I assure you," Jake glanced briefly at Harper, then back at the jury, "this case is not as simple as it seems." The courtroom was silent. Even Judge Reynolds, who had been preparing for a disaster, found himself momentarily intrigued. But Reynolds wasn't about to let this slide without comment. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "That was a cute speech, kid." Jake simply folded his hands behind his back, waiting. Reynolds tilted his head. "Tell me, Mr. Lawson, where exactly did you get your law degree?" "A cereal box." The courtroom chuckled. Jake didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. "No, Your Honor. Just a library card and a lot of free time." The chuckles stopped. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. He had expected nervousness, a stammering excuse, not a sharp, quick-witted comeback. "Is that so?" the judge muttered, drumming his fingers on the bench. "Well, we'll see how long that holds up." The prosecution presented its first witness, the store owner, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, clearly ready to bury Jake. "Did you see the defendant in your store on the night of the robbery?" Harper asked. "I did." "And was he acting suspiciously?" "Absolutely. I saw him loitering near the electronics section. Then, later, my stock was missing." "Thank you," Harper said smugly. No further questions. All eyes turned to Jake. His first real test. Jake stepped forward, hands in his pockets, completely at ease. "You said you saw me in your store. What time was that?" The store owner frowned. "Sometime around 8:30 p.m. Jake nodded. "And the robbery took place at 10:15 p.m. "Correct." The store owner hesitated. "Well, yes, but—" Jake held up a receipt. "Your security logs show that I purchased a soda at 8:35 p.m. and left the store. If I was gone, how could I have committed the crime?" The store owner stammered. Harper jumped up. "Objection. That doesn't prove anything." Jake cut him off smoothly. "Not yet." The judge narrowed his eyes. The mockery was gone. Next, the prosecution called their second witness, a supposed eyewitness who had claimed Jake was the thief. Jake's questions were surgical. "You said you saw me running from the store?" "Yes." "At what distance?" About 30 feet. "And it was dark outside, right?" "Yes, but—" Jake pulled out a printed study. "Are you aware that eyewitness identification in low-light conditions is only about 50% accurate?" The witness's confidence wavered. The jury started taking notes. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. For the first time, he wasn't amused. He was curious. Harper's composure was slipping. His once smug grin had faded. Jake wasn't floundering. He was flipping the script. Then, Jake did something no one expected. He pulled out a legal case file. "Your Honor, I'd like to cite State v. Halpert, 2009, in which a conviction was overturned due to unreliable eyewitness testimony in poor lighting conditions." The courtroom stirred. Even Reynolds looked surprised. "You're citing case law now?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jake said, his tone neutral. "Since the prosecution has based their argument heavily on eyewitness accounts, it's only fair that we examine how reliable those accounts really are." The judge stared at him for a long moment. Then, with the smallest of smirks, he nodded. "Proceed." Harper was now visibly flustered. He flipped through his notes, scrambling. This was not supposed to happen. The jury was paying attention, really paying attention. As Harper struggled, Jake's mind flashed back to where it all began. Years ago, a dusty old law library, filled with books no one ever touched. A young Jake, barely 14, sitting cross-legged on the floor, his nose buried in a thick case law textbook. He didn't have formal training, but he had something else, an obsession. Every free moment, every break between school and work, He was studying, absorbing everything he could. Then there was Mr. Calloway, the retired defense attorney who had once been one of the best. An old man with tired eyes, who had seen something in Jake that no one else had. "You've got the mind for this, kid," Calloway had muttered one evening, watching Jake argue against a court transcript like it was a chess match. Jake had soaked up every lesson, every legal principle, every loophole and strategy Calloway had ever taught him. And now, it was paying off. Back in the courtroom, Jake turned to the judge, his arguments laid out with precision. Judge Reynolds was no longer smirking. Instead, he leaned forward, eyes locked onto Jake with something new, something that hadn't been there before. Was it respect? Harper swallowed hard, knowing that something was shifting. For the first time in his career, Judge Reynolds was asking himself a question he had never expected. Had he just underestimated this kid? The tension in the courtroom is thick enough to cut with a knife. The prosecution is confident, too confident. They believe they've trapped Jake with airtight evidence. But Jake, with an almost eerie calmness, straightens his tie and steps forward. "Your Honor, if I may," he says, voice unwavering. The judge sighs, ready to brush him off, but something in Jake's tone makes him pause. "Go on." Jake walks to the evidence table, holding up a single document, a report dismissed by the prosecution as irrelevant. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is the piece of the puzzle you've all been missing." The prosecuting attorney scoffs. "That was reviewed and deemed unimportant." Was it? Jake raises an eyebrow. He turns to the jury. "What if I told you that this document doesn't just prove my client's innocence, but also exposes the prosecution's negligence?" The entire courtroom leans forward. Jake flips through the pages, pointing out inconsistencies, timestamps that don't match, statements that contradict key witness testimonies, and a crucial detail that had been ignored, a missing surveillance footage clip that, if found, could exonerate his client. Why would they omit this? Jake asks, letting the question linger. "Because if you had seen it, we wouldn't be here today." Murmurs ripple through the crowd. The prosecution shifts uneasily. The judge's usual smirk falters. For the first time, Judge Reynolds looks genuinely unsettled. He had been enjoying the spectacle of a teenage boy floundering in court. But now, he's seeing something different, something almost unnerving. Jake isn't just holding his own. He's winning. Reynolds adjusts his glasses, trying to maintain his usual arrogant demeanor. "Are you implying that the prosecution deliberately withheld evidence?" "I'm not implying anything," Jake says smoothly. "I'm proving it." The courtroom gasps. The judge drums his fingers against his desk. He has two choices: shut Jake down and risk looking like he's complicit in a botched case, or allow this to unfold and admit that he grossly underestimated him. Reynolds takes a deep breath. "Continue." Jake doesn't just argue. He commands the room. He walks in front of the jury, his confidence growing with every word. He dismantles the prosecution's case piece by piece, not with emotion, but with cold, hard logic. "You've heard their witnesses," Jake says, turning toward the jury. "You've seen their evidence, and you've seen how quickly it falls apart under scrutiny." He pauses, looking each juror in the eye. "Now ask yourselves, if they were so sure of my client's guilt, why did they need to hide the truth?" Silence. Then, Jake turns toward Judge Reynolds. "And Your Honor, you said something at the start of this trial. You questioned my ability. You doubted me." The judge's face tightens. Jake doesn't flinch. "I don't blame you. But I'll tell you this. I'm not here to impress you. I'm here because an innocent man was nearly sent to prison for a crime he didn't commit. He steps back. And now, I rest my case. The courtroom is dead silent. The jury is sent to deliberate. Every second drags on like an eternity. The prosecution looks rattled. The judge is lost in thought. The crowd whispers, speculating. Then, the jury returns. The foreperson stands. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asks, his voice quieter than usual. Yes, Your Honor. The entire room holds its breath. In the case of the state versus Michael Carter, the foreperson swallows hard, then says the words that change everything. Not guilty. For a moment, there is stunned silence. Then, chaos, gasps, cheers, shocked murmurs. Michael Carter, Jake's client, covers his face with his hands in disbelief. His family bursts into tears. The prosecution looks utterly crushed. Jake simply exhales, a small smile tugging at his lips. Judge Reynolds watches the scene unfold. He clears his throat, silencing the room. He looks at Jake, long and hard. Then, with a rare and measured tone, he speaks. I have never been more glad to be proven wrong. A ripple of shock moves through the room. You may not have a law degree, Mr. Evans, the judge continues, but today, you gave a lesson in justice that this courtroom won't soon forget. He leans forward, his usual arrogance replaced with something that almost looks like respect. Have you considered a career in law? Jake smirks, his confidence unshaken. Maybe. The courtroom watches as the judge gives him a rare nod of approval. As Jake walks out of the courtroom, Michael Carter shakes his hand. Thank you. You saved my life. Jake nods, but something flickers in his eyes. Was this all part of a bigger plan? He glances back at the judge one last time. Then, with a knowing smile, he steps out into the world, his future wide open. The courtroom doors swing open, and a rush of emotions crashes into Jake all at once. Cheers, murmurs, the flashes of cameras. It's overwhelming. But none of it matters the moment he sees his mother. She stands there, hands clasped over her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. In an instant, she's rushing forward, wrapping him in a tight embrace. "Oh, Jake," she whispers, her voice trembling with pride. "I always knew you were special, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined." Jake chuckles softly, hugging her back. "I had to make sure the right thing was done, Mom." She pulls back, cupping his face. "And you did. No matter where this takes you next, never forget who you are." Jake nods, feeling the weight of what just happened settle into his bones. He didn't just win a case, he changed lives. The moment he steps outside, chaos erupts. Reporters swarm around him, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward his face. Jake Evans, how does it feel to have outsmarted a seasoned prosecutor? Did you ever doubt yourself during the trial? Are you planning to pursue law as a career? Jake holds up his hands, trying to push through, but it's impossible. The case has already become a sensation. Headlines flood the news within hours. Teen legal prodigy stuns judge in court. High schooler wins impossible case, without a law degree. Jake Evans, the boy who outplayed the system. Colleges and law schools start reaching out, their emails pouring in, full scholarship offers, special mentorship programs, internships with prestigious firms. Jake had never imagined this outcome. He had only wanted justice. But now, the world was watching, and expecting something bigger from him. Among the reporters and chaos, the prosecutor approaches Jake. The once confident man now looks humbled. "You did something incredible in there," he says, extending a hand. I've been in this field for 15 years, and you just outplayed me." Jake hesitates for a second before shaking his hand. "I wasn't trying to beat you," he says sincerely. "I was just trying to do what was right." The prosecutor studies him, then chuckles. "That's exactly why you're dangerous. You play fair, and still win." Jake smirks. "Guess I had a good teacher," he says, thinking of all the books, cases, and trial sessions he had studied over the years. The prosecutor steps back, shaking his head with admiration. "If you ever decide to take the bar exam early, let me know. I'd love a rematch." As the crowd begins to disperse, Judge Reynolds lingers near the exit. When Jake catches his eye, the older man gestures for him to come closer. Jake walks over, expecting another snide remark. Instead, Reynolds surprises him. "You proved me wrong, kid," he says, his voice quieter than usual. "And that doesn't happen often." Jake tilts his head. "Why were you so hard on me in there?" Reynolds chuckles. "Maybe I saw a bit of myself in you." He pauses, then sighs. "Or maybe I just didn't want to believe that someone without a law degree could be smarter than half the attorneys in my courtroom." Jake grins. "And now?" The judge studies him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he smiles, a real, genuine smile. "If you ever decide to become a lawyer," he says, "let me know. I'd be honored to see you in my courtroom again." The words hang in the air, heavier than Jake expected. It's not just an offer. It's an invitation into a world he never thought he belonged to. As Jake walks away, he can't help but wonder, was all of this meant to happen? Did the judge mock him because he recognized something familiar in Jake? Some reflection of his own past? Or was it just fate leading Jake to his true calling? One thing is certain. This wasn't the end of Jake Evans' story. It was just the beginning. The air in the courtroom is thick with anticipation. The murmurs of the crowd fade as a young man in a crisp navy blue suit steps forward, adjusting his tie with steady hands. Jake Evans stands at the counsel's table, no longer the underestimated teen, no longer the kid fighting for respect. Now, he's attorney Jake Evans. His opponent, a seasoned prosecutor, sizes him up, a hint of doubt in his eyes. It's a look Jake has seen before. The same look people gave him when they thought he was just a kid who didn't belong in a courtroom. They had been wrong then, and they're about to be wrong again. As the judge calls for order, Jake takes a deep breath, turning to face the bench. He's been in courtrooms before, but this is different. This is his first official case as a lawyer. From the gallery, an older man watches, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. His once intimidating presence is now softened by time, his sharp eyes filled with something unexpected, pride. Judge Reynolds, now retired, nods slightly as their gazes meet. Jake feels the weight of that nod, the unspoken acknowledgement. Years ago, this same man had mocked him, dismissed him, tested him. Now, he's here, not as a skeptic, but as a believer. The courtroom falls silent as the trial begins. Jake picks up his notes, clears his throat, and smirks just slightly. This time, there's no doubt. He's exactly where he belongs, and he's ready to make history again.